Greetings and welcome to our very special webinar on Youth Leading the Movement, a global dialogue on anti-racism. My name is Tony Jenkins. I think many of you know me. I'm the coordinator of the Global Campaign for Peace Education, which is a global movement promoting peace education through building public awareness and political support for the introduction of peace education into all spheres of education, both formal and non-formal, as well as promoting the education of all teachers to teach for peace. And it's truly my pleasure to say just a very few words today, because it's not me who you are here to listen to. Today, we're here to emphasize the importance of listening to the voices of youth who will both inherit our world and are already the future leaders that we need today. This webinar was envisioned, developed, and conducted by youth with youth, right? It started more than 6 months ago when we brought on a remarkable group of summer interns from Georgetown University. Prior to preparing them for the work at hand with us, we invited this team to review the history, the current efforts, and all the content of the Global Campaign for Peace Education website. We wanted to get their feedback. And one of the things they reported back to us enthusiastically, quite enthusiastically, was a weakness in the campaign. The fact that we didn't have the inclusion of youth voices or youth perspectives, or very, very little. So the campaign has been really good at targeting educators and policymakers, but not so much at involving the voices of youth for whom peace education is a vital component of an education that they require to build a more just and equitable future. So we are deeply grateful for the leadership of our youth team, including Nazila Jamshidi, Narag Kuyumjian, Keaton Nara, and our most recent addition to our youth-led team, Kaylin Johnston. We've already learned a lot from you, and we hope that this is the beginning of many future efforts bringing youth to the foreground in our peace education work. So thank you very much. So I'm gonna go ahead now and step aside and turn this event over to Keaton Nara, who has been coordinating this dialogue since the early summer. So Keaton, over to you.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you all so much for attending Youth Leading the Movement, a global dialogue on anti-racism. Before we get into the actual webinar itself, I wanted to outline the overall goals for this webinar and how the next hour and a half will run. This webinar is focused on foregrounding youth voices in the current anti-racism and anti-ethnic discrimination movement around the world. The webinar's goal is threefold. One, to facilitate a productive dialogue on the issues of racial and ethnic discrimination. Two, to act as an empowering platform for youth voices in the peace-working space. And three, to explore the approach of peace education as a means to transform oppressive systems. To accomplish these goals, we have virtually interviewed peace builders from around the world and recorded them to share with you all today. We will begin the webinar by showing the 4 interview panels we conducted, then share some prepared questions my colleagues and I have made for panelists that are able to attend today. After our panelists answer these specific reflective questions, we will finally open it up to the full audience for a live Q&A session. To ask your question, please type them in the chat, and my colleague, Kaylin Johnston, will keep an eye on them as they come in. While we won't be answering these questions until the very end, please feel free to send them in throughout the duration of the webinar so that we can keep an eye on them. And with that, I would like to introduce the speakers and panelists that will be seen and featured in our first video, which is the Americas. Our first video will focus on the Americas with 3 panelists providing insight on this conflict. First, we have Elaine Williams, who serves as the current director of RVA Thrives with Virginia Community Voice, an NGO focused on empowering neighborhoods of marginalized communities. Next, we have Kathy Sun, who is a special assistant to the CEO at Search for Common Ground, an international peacebuilding NGO. Finally, we will have Allison Chan, the former executive director and interim communications director of Stand Canada, a youth-led anti-genocide organization. And with that, I believe Tony will be sharing screen and start the video.
had a conversation at Search, like an all staff meeting with our headquarters staff in DC, again, done virtually. And it was through those conversations that I actually started to realize, I mean, I saw how angry and frustrated everyone was, right? That was just probably the biggest immediate reaction. But also a lot of people started talking about stories of hope, right? So specific instances with their family, with their friends, that indicated that actually people were starting to change their minds. Their mindsets were starting to shift. And for me, that was really hopeful. And so after that happened, I started engaging a little bit more on social media, reading more about what was happening. I personally was not super familiar with police abolition as an idea before, and so I started doing a lot more reading and listening around that topic. Things have died down a little bit. They're not as energetic and people are not as passionate about it as they were before, but I have seen a lot more people kind of educate themselves, really try to listen to what other people are saying, which I think is very different from last time and does give me hope. I think a lot of systemic changes have not really been happening in a meaningful way, but I'm hoping that that will eventually change, because I mean, systems change takes time. And so unfortunately, we have to be somewhat patient with that, but I do think that this time is different based on the ways that I've seen people respond.
As a Black woman, I think my experience with police brutality as well as racism, systemic racism, has been long before George Floyd's death. I think George Floyd's death has awakened more people because of the exposure of social media. But the experiences of devaluing Black lives for me had gone way before that. And so the experience for me was not another. This can't be happening again to someone who reflects my community. And it had been very tragic and traumatizing for myself and people who look like me to have to experience at the hand of a system that's supposed to protect us to brutally assassinate us continuously. And before George Floyd, there was Breonna Taylor, there was Ahmaud Arbery, there was Philando Castile, and the list goes on. So for me, I think my frustration and my anger has always been that the system that's embedded in white supremacy as the US has never valued Black lives. And so my exposure to this is every day in my community when I see, I think for me, it moved beyond just seeing what happened to George Floyd, because I think that was awakening for many people in the US. Because it was more like, we hear about the violence, we hear about what happened, but as soon as it leaves the media, everything goes back to normal. And for me, that's not my normal. That has never been my normal. Just acknowledging that we're all called to the movement in different ways and honoring where we are. So the ways I've been able to do something in my community is honoring that I'm a healer by nature. That's what I see myself as. So how do I bring people into a space to be able to dialogue about their trauma, dialogue about this experience, and also work through healing while holding our systems of oppression accountable to create change, and acknowledging that the change starts with us. Like, we can't depend on a system of oppression to heal us or free us. It was me taking my power back and saying that I no longer need to make white people comfortable at the expense of my own peace of mind and sanity. And so for me, that was a part of the healing process, but also allowing people to sit in their anger and frustration.
As a progressive Canadian organization, is that there's several layers to this. Like, from my perspective, there's the layer that you work on yourself, like your inner works. So, for example, I know that people my age, millennials, it's become a lot more common to do the inner work for, like, for example, to be a better partner in your relationships. But at the same time, it's also been about doing the inner work in analyzing what are the systems of power at play, and also what are the systems of oppression, and how do they continue to benefit certain groups.
In the US, the issue is a Black and white issue, right? And it's been this way for hundreds and hundreds of years, right? The inception of slavery and Black folks being brought, well, individual from African descent being brought to the US, and being devalued, seen as 3/5 of a person, like all those things, right, has created the America that we see today, that has created all the inequities that we see today, right? And I believe that even though the form of enslavement has changed, the foundation is still the same, right? And so I believe that's the issue, and that's the illness. And I saw it on a CNN, I think it was the topic, it was like, we're facing two diseases, racism and COVID-19, right? And we don't not, so it's not as blatant as it was back years ago when slavery was still legal. Now it's more so, let's incarcerate Black and brown folks at a higher rate than any other race. Or it's, let us discriminate against someone with buying a house and getting a mortgage loan or redline. It's all of these factors now that we still show you that you're inferior and we're superior, but we don't make it feel like it's so blatant and overt anymore. We're going to find a way to take you down. So I believe like the foundation of this country has been built on white supremacy. It's still being upheld. And even with bringing, I love how people say, Barack Obama was president for 8 years. Racism doesn't exist anymore. That's a lie, right? Like, I love Dr. Tessie Cottman's book, Thick. She has a beautiful quote that's like, we have to allow, the system has to allow there to be exception to the rule for us to believe that there isn't a rule, right? Like, it's no longer the system problem or why I'm in the space I'm in. It's now my problem, right? We had a Black president. That's your issue now, right? It's not a race issue, but we see it day to day, right? When a Black man can be gunned down for standing and trying to break up an intercase, like not just after George Floyd, the brutal killing of George Floyd, right? Then we have Jacob Blake and his life, right? Like, we have all of these things still happening in this moment where you're constantly seeing like, this is a race issue, and it's still to this day. So that will be my answer to that question.
To respond to Elaine, like it kind of seems like that. Like, I mean, I love Obama, and I love Michelle as well. But it kind of seems like that. You know, the post-Obama era is kind of like Obama. He's kind of like a tokenism. When he is not. Like I love, like I said, I love Barack, I love Michelle, but he is not the most progressive president that America has ever had, or even the most progressive presidential candidate. So, you know, I think that's like a really interesting topic to talk about. Like, you know, after the post-Obama era, it was kind of like, have we entered a post-racial society? But the reality is no. Like, there's so many more layers that need to be addressed. You can't just have this like person saying, "Oh, we did it, it's done."
I know amazing Black leaders that are still oppressed in seats of power. And I think I look at this issue of being like, how do you begin to even acknowledge that even when you have someone in a position of power and they are a person who identify as African American or Black or Indigenous or a person of color, do they really have power? Is the question I pose. Like, how far will a system that's embedded in white supremacy allow you before they stop you? And it's repeated in history where I'll let you get to the table, but I'm not going to let you get out the room, right? So it's this notion that you can have the power, and I want the world to believe that we're progressive and we're post-racial, but I will not let you get any farther that can transform us into an actual anti-racist nation.
One of the conflicts that we do have, particularly you know, in British Columbia, my province, is like the notion of resource development projects. And like, we are on unceded territory. That basically means that like in BC, like there haven't been treaties signed for a lot of like the land. So therefore, formally, per the Constitution, the federal government and the provincial government need to have like prior informed consent with the Indigenous groups that you know, have been living in that territories for millennia. At the same time, like, you know, to relate back to what you're saying, Elaine, about tokenism and having like that one person, what I'm seeing is that I am seeing that, like, in terms of resource development projects, like there are companies who are and pro resource development organizations who are basically saying, oh well, we got the sign off from this one like indigenous chief or this one indigenous fraction, when like you look at that, like the vast majority of like indigenous peoples, particularly in BC, are opposed to some of like the major pipelines that have been discussed.
I want to directly start with some points that Elaine made to the last question. I think to her point, at least specifically in the US, there aren't very many like legal ways in which discrimination is justified, right? Exactly the opposite, right? It's illegal to discriminate based on race, gender, etc. But that fundamentally has not changed the ways that people think and behave, right? Like in this country, it's still like people think white people are superior to people of other races and ethnicities, and that might not be something that people are willing to own up to or explicitly say, but it's very much a reality in exactly the ways that Elaine has described it. And so I would say, like, kind of similar to what Allison was saying, right? Like, one of the first things that needs to change is individuals' behaviors and mindsets and the ways that they're thinking about these issues, right? And so it is on the onus of individual people to educate themselves, to listen to other people's experiences that they might not be able to identify with, right? Like me as an Asian American who came from an upper middle class background, like there are certain levels of privilege that I have and certain experiences that I will never understand. And so I need to spend a lot of time listening, right? Listening to people like Elaine, listening to others that I will never be able to experience that world. But I do know that like we need to do more work in trying to shift people's mindsets and behaviors. And it's not just on the onus of people of color, right? Like this needs to be something that we all do. I think for way too long, it's been expected that Black people educate everyone, which is just not okay, right? That's not how it's supposed to be. As a society, this is a problem that we have all created and that we all need to address.
And like the way I see young people coming into this movement is acknowledging what are your strengths? What do you have? What is that thing that you have that no one else have? And be able to really allow your light to shine in that space. And so I believe like we all have gifts. Like my gift may not be protesting, or my gifts may not be talking to politicians. My gifts may be healing or doing art or doing something that really helps keep the movement moving forward. And also acknowledging the power that's in your experiences, the power that's in who you are. Like me as a young adult, I am a person who's been gifted to speak truth to power. I come to tables, I see white supremacy showing up, I call it out. I let you sit with discomfort, I let you deal with that, I let you unpack that. But I'm not gonna sit at this table and pretend like nothing exists. And I'm okay with walking away acknowledging that in my Blackness, I have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable when everyone else is uncomfortable. Because as we've been taught to survive for many years, I've been taught that if I assimilate to white culture, then I can stay between the lines and I can survive, right? My life won't be taken if I obey what white supremacy has taught me. No more. So I would say young people continue to say no more and stand behind that no more, acknowledging that you don't have to continue to allowing the status quo be the status quo. And I believe that inner work is so important, because just because it's been passed down and taught to you doesn't mean it's right. I believe that the issue is big, but I believe that if we begin to do our inner work, if we begin to say no more and also stand in our truth and our gifts, we can create the change we want to see and also be that.
What do we do like as like youth? Like how do we show allyship while not co-opting their voices? And like how do we basically be the best ways to like shape the societies that we want, which is a more fair, which is a more kinder society, more equal society. And so for me, like I personally also face this from like an individual level. It's more so like I am like a person of color, like I'm like the model minority, right? And like Kathy, you did touch on that. But at the same time, it's like how do we like navigate the system where we are working for people but without speaking for them?
And I would also, I would say, yes, young people are the future, but they are very much the present, right? The Black Lives Matter movement was started by young people. Like most major movements and social changes that happen in society are spearheaded by young people. Like Martin Luther King, when he gave his I Had a Dream speech, was like 24 years old. Like a lot of people forget how young a lot of these like big kind of peace builder, like activist people are. Like it's all young people, right? And I think nowadays with social media, young people have so much more power to have their voices be heard. And so I would say, as a young person, like never think that you are not powerful, that you are not able to create significant change, because that's just historically been proven wrong. I think there's a misconception that like oppression is purely beneficial for the oppressor, right? That like oppressive systems, particularly when it comes to white supremacy, like, oh, well, like, you know, white people don't have to worry about that. Oh, like it only benefits them, right? Like that's not the case, right? Like oppressive systems are bad for everyone, right? That's just been shown over and over and over again, right? Like if you have to oppress others in order to have power, that's not real power, right? And you constantly feel like threatened by it because your power isn't true. It's not real, right? It's not legitimate. And so like how do you start to show white people that that's the case, and that the current system they might think works for them, but it really actually doesn't, right? Like white fragility proves that, right? The fact that you just even bring up this concept and people completely shut down, like that makes it very clear that clearly the system doesn't work for them either.
Looking at it from a universal perspective of like, if the most marginalized needs are met and they're able to have equity, everyone has equity. Being that someone who sits at the multi aspects of the table, I'm doing the fight and living the experience. That's exhausting. Like I'm living this every day. I don't get to tap out. I don't get to say, oh, well, I'm not going to turn the news on. I got to endure it. I have to endure this every single day. And so for me, sometimes I have to step away and say that this is not, I've said my piece. I've brought myself to this table to be a healer. I brought myself to this table to be a reconciler, but you don't even see that there's a need of it.
So ultimately, solidarity, being there for the long fight. It's going to be a long fight for racial and ethnic equality and equity. And it's okay to take breaks within these fights. The thing is, like within STAND, we are a volunteer-run organization. Like our organization, like we are known to basically go through like ebbs and flows, because like we'll go through like peaks where we would spend a lot of time working on campaigns, but then also recognizing that when we go through like our like slight valleys, which is like it's more so of like recharging, so that you know we can keep going.
We're in a time where radical imagination is so important. Like just like, what is your wildest dreams of a world where liberation and equity is the norm, right? And I would just encourage young people, dream of that world and do whatever it takes to achieve that, right? Like, I believe that takes resistance, but also peace building, and as well as coming to that notion of coming to the table, right? Like, I appreciate the diversity of experience and diversity of knowledge and just wisdom, and having intergenerational dialogues like we are. And encouraging more dialogues, encouraging more ways of understanding each other, but also in that encouragement, accountability, holding each other accountable to not going back to business as usual, and allowing the status quo be the same narrative we have for centuries to come.
I would also add to Elaine's point about kind of dreaming big and going after that dream. So I think two points, and I think Elaine kind of spoke to this, but you know, finding the right people to help you get there. And I would encourage people not to just look for the usual suspects, right? Like reach across those divides, try to better understand the experiences of other people. And that should lead you to like being open to having your dream change, right? So I was listening to a podcast on police abolition, and the guest is, you know, a big police abolitionist and activist. And the interviewer asked her, so what does the world look like with police abolition? And she says, honestly, I have no idea, because we all need to build that together, right? So I think, you know, definitely having your dream of what you want the world to look like, but being humble enough to acknowledge the fact that you have a very limited perspective and you need other people's perspectives to help you get there and to help you not just realize that dream, but reimagine it. In order to build a better world, right, it has to include everyone. That's exactly how we got into the problems that we're in right now, is by not including people who need to be included in the decision making. Again, I don't have the answers as to like how exactly to do this, because it's hard, right? To be able to take, for example, a Black person and a neo-Nazi, put them in the same room together and be like, look, we need to create a better system that works for everyone. Like, I'm not going to pretend to know exactly how to do that. But I think that's ultimately the only way that we're going to be able to come up with creative solutions that will actually build a better society. And I think that's really where the peace building part comes into play. Because at the end of the day, right, peace building is simply an approach for problem solving. It's a radically inclusive approach for problem solving. And so I think we need to definitely take that lens in terms of figuring out how we can dismantle unjust systems.
Social life that
The next video will feature our panelists from South Asia. First, we have Abdul Ghaffar Nazari, a civil society activist who will be discussing discrimination in Afghanistan. Next, we have Hile Yoon, who's a Cora Vice Fellow on Peace Building at the Global Network of Women Peace Builders. And she's also the founder and CEO of Afghan Women Welfare and Development Association. One of our youngest panelists, Arvind Shams Siddiqui, is also featured in this video, and he will be providing insight into ethnic and racial discrimination in Bangladesh. Finally, our final South Asian panelist is Emerin Capre. Emerin will be discussing her work in India as a program manager of IMPLAS NGO network.
actually the George Floyd's death, it was a triggering for us, I mean for Afghan people, because it remembered the killing of Farhonda, who was beaten and burned by public in the main city of Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan. And listening to news, we tried to find the video and watch several times, and it was distressing and horrible to deal with. I think for this George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter campaign started, and then especially in Afghanistan, people have added Afghan Lives Matter, or let's say bring it down to Hazara Lives Matter, and we had a lot of social campaign on that.
So when we look at this situation, there was a little bit of hypocrisy in it too, because India as a whole, they were very sad. They acknowledged the fact that George Floyd, the incident of George Floyd was unfair, and it was a part of racism, and he was discriminated. But at the same time, India is also a place where there's a lot of prejudice, biases, and racism against a lot of people from the northeast of India, which they sometimes mostly do not acknowledge that. So hence there was a little bit of hypocrisy in that. But how this incident played in my community was very deep, and it really affected us, and it really made us reflect of these things that can happen in the world. It can happen to us and anywhere else. And we racism is a common threat, and we really need to take actions forward on how do we go about entirely abolishing racism from the world.
The issues in Bangladesh are more about ethnic discrimination than really racial divides or things of that sort. But even still, the main things that the issue really showed us was the fact that it was a very graphic representation of human beings being extremely violent towards each other, and how prejudices can really take us from our comfort zones, and it can put us in situations where there is real harm being posed to another person. George Floyd lost his life simply because he was a Black person in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the idea that something like that could happen to another person, especially coming from people who are supposed to protect our community, especially from police officers, was, again, a really graphic representation of what the world is really like, unfortunately.
So I'm basically based in New York, but the moment when this whole Black Lives Matter movement started in US, we knew that racial discrimination existed in US, but it was the first time that the movement Black Lives Matter became so big, and it was all over the social media. And within Afghanistan, there were very positive responses as well, because right when the Black Lives Matters movement started in Afghanistan, at the same time, a lot of our Afghan migrants, when they were going to Iran to cross the border, they were brutally tortured by the Iranian guards. And this is the racial discrimination that existed between Iran and Afghanistan from a long time ago. But since the Black Lives Matters movement started in the US, it really inspired Afghans as well to start their own movement as well, which was called #Afghan Life Matters. So this was a very positive response for the first time that the Afghan civil society started. And also they also started a new hashtag, which was like, I can't breathe and I also need water. Because back the incident that happened in Iran, two of our Afghan immigrants, they were burning alive in a car accident, and nobody was giving them water anymore, although there were a lot of Iranian guards that were in that place, but nobody was helping them anymore because of the racial discrimination that exists between Iran and Afghanistan. So when this whole Black Lives Matters started in US, it sparked a very outreach in Afghanistan as well. And this is one of the positive responses from the Afghan community started, and this was a very positive reaction toward this whole movement in Afghanistan. So ethnic and racial discrimination issue is a very long-lasting issue in Afghanistan, and throughout the history there was like different conflict between different ethnic tribes in Afghanistan, and this is one of the issues that there is instability in Afghanistan. But at the same time, we have racial discrimination and ethnic issue with our neighboring countries as well, especially with Pakistan and especially with Iran, because a lot of discrimination exists within the border with these two countries. For example, just like I said before, that a lot of our immigrants who goes to Pakistan and who also goes to Iran, they face a lot of racial discrimination that just because they are Afghan. And there are a lot of police and police brutality exists within the border as well towards Afghan citizens. But at the same time, we have ethnic and racial conflict in Afghanistan as well between different ethnic and tribal groups in Afghanistan.
I think discrimination in Afghanistan is one of the major challenges of the social life that we are dealing with, and a source of violence and a key factor behind the continuation of violence. I think we need the effort to make achieve a safe and non-discriminatory society in order to eliminate this discrimination?
Like there are so many scenarios and situations I can talk about when I say that there are different kind of ethnic violations that takes place in India, especially for the northeastern people, because we look very different. We look more, we have more Mongolian features than we have that of the normal, I mean, the rest of India. I mean, how the world perceive India is that of Rajasthan, Delhi, Bombay, and Bollywood, but they don't know that there is another part of India that looks very different. Secondly, I work on anti-human trafficking. So what I have seen is that a lot of girls from the Northeast gets trafficked because of their looks. There is this entire, notion that Northeastern women are very fragile, they're very dainty and submissive. Hence, they get, more trafficked to the rest of the country and also to the other parts of the world, because they have these very stark Asian looking features. So this is one of the ethnic violation that we see. And when Northeastern people go and live in other cities in India, they face a lot of discrimination because of how they look. There would be landlords who would not give them house to live in because they have this preconceived idea about the Northeastern being wild, because we're tribal. So they think we're wild people, we're head hunters, we eat people and we eat dogs. And there are so many preconceived notions about us in the rest of India. So this is one of the ethnic discrimination we see happening for a lot of Northeastern people in India.
Bangladesh in general has, aside from the ethnic majority, we essentially have two different groups of ethnic minorities. The larger the larger population is in the hilly areas near Chittagong and the Chittagong Hill Tracts districts. And the other group is those living in the flatlands near Mymensingh. So the discrimination against these groups is mostly more targeted, like historically has been mostly more targeted towards those in the Chittagong Hill Tracts areas. And there is a history of this discrimination. There is a history of even violence against these ethnic minorities. That is basically because of that relocation, because of that historic discrimination that was at that time, and because of the sort of inbuilt belief that exists even now. These people are somehow less human. These people are somehow not part of us or different, and which is why it's sort of somehow justified to discriminate against them. The ideologies still persist, and the ideologies are the problems that we are facing even now.
Nazila, I just wanted to add something to what Arvind had to say. So I come from the state called Meghalaya in the northeast of India, and Meghalaya is closely situated to Bangladesh. So the ethnic tribe he's talking about are the tribe, the people of my community who live on the other part of India. And so they are also, I'm a Khasi, and so these people are also Khasis. And before pre-independence, there was no India and everybody lived differently. So as soon as independence happened of India, so there was a demarcation of borders. So a lot of people of my community started living in what was before called East Pakistan, now called Bangladesh. So they live there, and these are the people of my community who actually go through a lot of discrimination, especially at the hands of the paramilitary forces like the border guards of Bangladesh. A lot of women go through a lot of rapes and different kinds of sexual exploitations because of what Arvind said, the community they come from. They think we're savages.
We should support each other. I mean, we should support youth in order to fight this discrimination. I think many organizations do a fantastic job on this, but but still we need to work. For example, the organizations that I'm involved with is what we do is time to time we have workshops, we have seminars for youth, citizens, in order to raise their awareness, and especially when something happens, that we stand with the people, and then we have conferences, press conferences, and we release statements in order to support people.
Afghanistan has more than 60% of our population are young, and they can play a very crucial role in this regard. Our organization, we recently launched a program called the Peace Builders Club, where we have members from 34 provinces of Afghanistan from different ethnic background and culture. And with what we do in Peace Builders Club is that we have 4 programs that addresses all of the issue related to discrimination, ethnic discrimination, women empowerment, and all the problems that youth have in Afghanistan. We usually try to address those problems. One of the programs that we have within the Peace Builder Club is the Peace Building Dialogues. We actually do conduct youth peace building dialogue in different provinces. For example, in Nangarhar province, we conduct peace building dialogue with religious leaders, ethnic leaders, and tribal leaders in that province from different communities. We gather them together, and at the same time, we talk about different issues, whether it's related to youth participation in the current Afghan peace process, women participation in the current Afghan peace process. And one of the issues that we tackle and we put pressure more on it is how we can involve young women peace builders in these youth community peace building dialogues in different provinces, because we want to amplify their voices and different matters. And the other program that we have in this Peace Builder Club is called peer mentorship. What we do is we actually target government high schools in Afghanistan, and specifically girls high school in Afghanistan. And we have a program called Peace Goes to School. So what we do, we actually try to train young students from grade 11, 12, and 9. And what we do is that we teach them about culture awareness, culture understanding, how many tribes exist in Afghanistan, what type of discrimination there are in Afghanistan. And we also motivate them and provide them training about their career choices. Because why we target these young peace builders from high school? Because we want to build leaders from a very young age.
I think as youth, as the next generation, and for generations that come after us, I think the most important thing is that it is up to us, not just as individuals, but as a community as a whole, to unlearn the prejudices that were taught to us, that are still propagated systematically. Because, and just to give you an example to put this into perspective, I have a friend named Oshim, who is from the Chakma minority in our country. And one day, while going back to his hostel at night, while he was walking outside of the hostel gate, 2 children, and emphasis on children, because these kids were not much older than 8, maybe 8 to 10 from what he said. So these 2 kids, they run up to him, this person who is walking alone on the street, minding his own business, and out of nowhere, they point at him and they go, basically, the exact Bangla is Uidak Chingchong, which is a very common trope, and sadly a common trope that still persists. And mind you, my friend, he wasn't doing anything to them. He was minding his own business. He was going up to his hostel room. And these kids, out of nowhere, they felt, not only did they feel that it was an okay thing to do, but the fact that these are such young kids means that the problem exists unto that level. The fact that, and again, children don't learn to hate. Children are not born with the idea of hate, with the idea of discrimination. Hate is taught. And for kids this young, knowing this specific bit of discrimination and the fact that it wasn't just a one-off thing. They knew exactly who they were saying it to. They knew exactly what they were saying. Maybe they didn't know the history of discrimination behind it. Maybe they didn't know the weight of what they were saying, but they saw it as something that they could say. Probably because their parents do, probably because their aunts and uncles do, probably because the older figures in their life do, because they had to have learned it from somewhere. And that, I feel, is the single biggest issue to tackle for us as the youth. It is up to us to unlearn it from ourselves, and it is up to us to teach our children and our grandchildren and the generations after us not to learn these things, to respect people as being human.
Firstly, young people should really focus on, working towards this from the place of empathy. They really need to understand how, why, when, and, focus on, not hating your perpetrator, but understanding the place they're coming from, and work and, create a space where everybody can actually work together. We need to have a much more positive outlook. Then we should not be like what our past generations have been, where we're so involved in criticizing what the government has not done, what the young people are not doing, what the community is not doing. But we as a young person, I feel we should really focus on what we can do together to make it better.
Especially in Afghanistan, we face a lot of challenges, and because when you do these kind of jobs, especially when it is voluntary and you do volunteerism, I think sometimes most of the people resist. They say that I mean, change is not easy, especially in Afghanistan, to make. People resist. And people blame us for doing this. People blame youth for doing this. And most of the time, people say that they have projects from the West, and they implement for money. I think this is the challenge that most of the time we face. And whenever we do something, whenever we innovate or we bring a project which is very successful in other countries, when we bring in Afghanistan, and then people stand against it, and then they say that it's most of the time they say that it's against our culture.
But one of the issue that we face is the lack of funding from the government and international community. And in order to do this, and in order to conduct these programs, we also need security and political will. And that is one of the struggles that a lot of youth leaders face in Afghanistan. Just like Abdul Ghaffar says, the culture of volunteerism is not very strong in Afghanistan. A lot of youth, if you tell them, okay, this is activity is pure volunteer based, you will not receive any money, or we cannot give you anything. So they actually back out, they don't help you. And this is one of the things that we actually want to tackle, is to encourage youth to do volunteer activities, because a lot of Afghanistan is a poor community, and we might not have funding for different projects. And we need to have like a very strong volunteer program to involve youth peace builder from different tribes, from different ethnic groups, to solve these problems.
And we really need to also look at making consistent noise. For example, the George Floyd incident happened, and everybody, in the whole world, they just went crazy. They started talking about Black Lives Matter. There was a whole different conversation about racism, but the fact is that racism was happening even before George Floyd's death. So you see, and then now the entire noise is actually coming down again. So we have to wait for another death to happen for actually people to talk about racism. So we should not do something like that. We should make consistent noise. We have technology in our hand as our powerful tool. We should use that to actually create conversations in our everyday lives, have conversations with our friends and family about racism and ethnic violations. We can do these small things to actually build a better place to live for everyone in this world.
we need to talk about these things. As Emerine said, the voices are dying down again. We shouldn't have to need another death, another George Floyd, another Breonna Taylor in order to bring up this conversation again. And not just in the US. The US is out and about in protest of this. But in light of this, we, as the international community, need to realize what's happening, not like the fact that it exists in every country, the fact that someone somewhere always is going to need help, not only to survive these situations, but also to help fight them.
I'm speaking as a civil society representative here, is that a lot of grassroots civil society organization that works in Afghanistan to tackle these problems, they should be funded. And there is a need for political support as well from not only international community, but also from the local community and from the government as well. For example, right now, the other problem that I just said, like there is a huge digital divide between women that not accessing and not having access to technology and everything. So how can we know that we are hearing their voices, we are hearing their concern? This is something that international community can help us with.
I think as an international community, firstly, this itself is a very good platform for all of us to come together and talk about it. And we should have more such platforms like this and have more young people coming in and talking about their perspective, about what they think about racial discrimination or ethnic violation as a whole. Secondly, I feel like there should be a lot more exchange programs. Usually we have seen that there are more cultural exchange programs happening, but then I think it will be one of a kind when there will be a cultural program where people are coming to talk about racism. You know, we can have a lot of international community coming to the northeast of India and seeing it themselves of how northeast of India is and how beautifully different it is from the rest of India. And
okay, so our third panel will be a brief interview featuring Andrii Sikoryn, our youngest panelist who will be focusing on Ukraine. Andrii is a youth peer-to-peer trainer and facilitator and also a leader in the Young Initiative Double N, a team of youths from Ukraine who encourage youth participation through peer-based leadership.
Many people were shocked and their reactions were mostly emotional. I think they were mostly emotional because of this video that is like the last minutes of his life, and it was horrible. I have a friend that told me she was crying while watching this, but mostly youth were shocked. I know that many NGOs in Ukraine have organized like protest and actions of support of movement Black Lives Matter. Ukrainians have long history of ethnic conflicts and ethnic discrimination. That it's very important fact. Like many years of our history, we were occupied by European empires, such as Russian Empire or the Polish or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and sometimes the ethnic group. Like sometimes Ukrainians were the minority, and they were like discriminated by their ethnic things. Right now, I read many researches about the racist and the level of discrimination in Ukraine. And many European organizations say that it is very important problems. And many European organizations say that it is very big problem in the government level in Ukraine. So it needs to be changed. And I know this power of change goes from the society, from the non-governmental sector like NGOs and etc. We have many problems. We have many other problems in Ukraine, but according to the researchers from European organizations, racism is a very big problem in Ukraine here. I read a research that says that we have problem with racist against two Russian people, and it is caused by the war that we have today in eastern Ukraine, and it's like we have many, especially in my region that is very nationalistic, and we have many right-wing organizations here in the Carpathian region in the western Ukraine. So Ukrainians do not like Russians. It's just an ethnic and history conflict that based in history and based on the today's situations. I think the youth right now are playing very important role. They are sharing information. They are sharing. They're just active. And the main role that youth play today, they just make actions. They just do something. They are not passive, and I think it's very important. The real changes comes from the third sector, from the civil society, and the best that the international community can do is support our civil sector, our civil society, to continue, to make them keep on doing what they're doing now. We need to press on our governments. Sometimes the international community should press on our governments, and it's a process that is happening right now. We should start to solve the problems from different sides of them. Works with the educational, works with the culture, help with the political situation, help with the rights, people rights, and I can say that the best way to to influence on the youth, it's through the education. So I think we have that situation with education here in Ukraine. It's better than the third world countries, but it's bad. And it should, an educational system, formal education, it changes from the government, because in the schools universities. And I can say that the best way to international community to influence positive on the Ukrainian youth is to support our education, is to support our formal education first, support non-formal organization, non-formal institutions.
So our final panel will be a brief interview, this time with Holkar Kaimova, to focus on Uzbekistan. Holkar is the program manager for Search for Common Ground, where she is administering a grant-making program for youth development organizations in the Andijan region.
The incident with George Floyd was constantly followed on all the TV channels, on the government channels, and almost all of the national level bloggers have blogged about it. And most of the people who had Russian TV channels were more active on this. So most of the people who had an access to Russian channels, they have been watching more about it. But I can say the reaction towards it was not as high as I've been following with my US friends, because one of the reasons is Uzbekistan does not have racial issues. We are multinational, but we are not a multiracial country. Maybe that was the reason that people could not really feel how the pain of what has happened with George Floyd. And if I compare this with any other global event, I compare this discrimination as to the times when I lived in China. I worked at Xinjiang Dashu in 2006. And I made friends with Chinese people, and I made friends with Uyghur people. And I could feel, as you know, this ethnical and cultural issues, the conflict is not very visible, but I could feel the pain or the suffering the Uyghur people had. They would tell me that all the high positions are taken only by Chinese people, and Uyghur people, even if they were very competent, it was hard for them to get in management system. So this I would compare with with a global event that I know. And if I come to Uzbekistan or our region, Fergana Valley, the ethnical or cultural conflict that is present in our system is, as I told you before, we are very multinational, and we have many nations who came to Uzbekistan during World War II. When I was younger, we used to have many Russians, Tatars, Korean people, Armenian people, almost all of the Soviet Union Republic nationalities were all living together, and they were very friendly. The atmosphere was very friendly. After Soviet Union, most of the people have left, but still in Uzbekistan right now we have around 5% Tajiks, Kazakhs. We also have Kyrgyz people and other nations. I can give an example of one community which is discriminated for many, many years. This community is called Lulis. in Uzbekistan, or we also call them Mugats. The origin of this ethnical group is not really known. Some people say they came from some part of Pakistan, and then they speak Tajik. And we don't know much about this ethnical group. And when we think or when we see these people, we usually really avoid them because in their identity we see mostly people who pick the garbage, or people who do pickpocketing and all the other activities like this. That's why mostly the people avoid them. You will never see any Lule community living together with Uzbeks. They usually have their own neighborhoods where they live, and then you never see their children attending our schools because they have their special school, and then even seeing them outside or using the same transportation with them is also a trouble, because most of the people, when they see this ethnic group in the transportation, they will either refuse taking the same transport, or there will be some conflict with it. What role our organization would play in dealing with this with this conflict is we are working on a project called Yoshstan. This is a new project. We'll have a kickoff next week. We haven't started yet, but this project will mainly focus on capacity building of youth society organizations in Andijan, in Fergana Valley, and also the local authorities in Andijan. So by helping them to get more effective and more inclusive society, we are thinking to empower youth and help the youth to get the leadership and get their issues to the government level. And by being a critical thinkers, they will be helping the community to deal with some of the problems we are facing in their communities. This project will also have sub-grants to civil society organizations, and they will be funding ideas that will be helping the community to grow and develop, and that will be helping with youth grievances. So my hope and my intention is that the group of youth will bring one of the ethnical problems to the view of government, and then I am hoping that one of the grants will be focusing on ethnical support of this group of people. It's not the government or only the people, it's also this ethnic group that most of them do not have even IDs. And most of them, when they go to school, they don't even have, their children don't have birth certificates. So I got to know about this ethnic group through one youth society organization in one of the conferences when we had with NGOs. There was a young guy, Alexander Barkovsky, who told more about this society. So in my perception, it was that this community does not want to be involved with us, and then they don't want to study, and then they chose easy life by digging garbage and making money by begging. But Alexander Barkovsky, he has a young guy. He had a project where he went into the communities of these Lulis or Mugats, and then he found out, and he interviewed many of the people, and he found out that they try to hide their identity, and then they don't really get the documents, just so that to hide from the government. And also they were interviewed and they said that they would really want their children to go to school and not to have the same life as they have. That's why, that's why they were hoping that one day they would also be equally attending schools, and they would also be getting jobs as all other community people around them. And I also know that there was a project in Tashkent. As we know, most of these people are homeless. So in Tashkent, near the garbage areas, they have built small houses, and then they gave these houses to the people. So these people could live near the garbage, and they could help to get the recycling stuff from the garbage, and then just segregate the garbage into different parts. And for that, they get paid and they make money from the garbage. And at the same time, they had a house living places in Tashkent. This was one of the projects that the government had. But I think in helping these Mugads, the main issue would be for them also to understand and to come to an approach and be more open to get some help from people to be included in the community. And what would we or international organizations could help with this issue is, most of the time, this community is so hidden, or all the ethnical conflicts are so invisible that we don't really realize or we don't really see them. So I would suggest the activists or the people who do not have indifference in this to bring these issues out by blogging or by some projects, so that people around could see and start to acknowledge all these problems. Because like even with Alexander Barkovsky's project, I didn't really pay much attention, and then when I talked to him, I was really impressed by what he is doing. He is bringing by photos the life of Mugads, and he's showing the life of these people to other communities. So projects like this, or bloggings of these people's lives and their desires, their intentions of what people they are, what they're doing, what are their dreams. This should also be shown to the people, so we could all feel that they are also people as us, and then they also have their plans, their intentions, and maybe this would help us to accept them and be more humanized towards them, and then see them as human beings. And my concluding message to the youth would be, I really like Mahatma Gandhi's saying, be the change you want to see in the world. I think every one of us have control of ourselves only. So I would suggest to start the change and seeing all this from ourselves. So if you change your own perception and start to seeing positive, so looking for a positive, I'm sure if every person will start doing this, this world would be a much better place to live for all of us.
We will now be transitioning into our prepared questions directed towards attending panelists. One of my colleagues, Nazila, will actually start us off by responding to the first question. But for all panelists who were able to attend, I can't see everyone's names on the screen, but I believe Andrii is here, Arwin, and Holgar, and Allison, and maybe a few others. If you could all unmute yourselves and turn on your cameras, that way it just makes the response time a little bit quicker, and we can all see you come on the main page. But Nazila will be answering our first question, which I will put in the chat. Based on the videos we just watched, were there any stories that struck you as helpful frameworks for approaching anti-racism work in your region?
Oh, thank you, Keaton. Just like our two panelists from Afghanistan mentioned, in Afghanistan, there is a large deal of discrimination, including gender, racial, religious discrimination. So considering the long history of racism against ethnic minority groups, anti-racism efforts require to be really long-term, focused, and collective. I believe many of us read The Kite Runner, a novel by Khaled Hosseini. I love this novel, which is the story of a Sunni Muslim boy and his Hazara Shia friend Hassan. The novel depicts the discrimination against ethnic minority group in Afghanistan, and the people, Hazara people or Shia people, the people whom it's hard to call them minority because they make up the third largest ethnic group in Afghanistan. And I don't know why people call them minority. However, they faced centuries of racial discrimination. So having said that, it's important to focus on growing awareness of existing racial and religious discrimination in Afghanistan. This requires like collective community action to change the status quo. The more people are informed about how racial discrimination embedded decades of war in Afghanistan, the more likely they want to do something about that. Also, in my opinion, educational institutions can play a crucial role in fighting against racial discrimination in Afghanistan. For example, the more professors incorporate this idea into courses, the more students actively become engaged in bringing racial inequalities and violences to the administration, and they in turn change the policies. Another way is to concentrate on the diversity and value it as an asset. Universities need to really, when I'm saying universities, I mean universities and institutional, educational institution in Afghanistan, to incorporate diversity into their different departments in order to improve racial equality. As I just mentioned, racial and gender discrimination is deeply rooted in the causes of many of the conflict that Afghans have been experiencing over the decade. So the sooner we do something about that, the sooner we are going to have a peaceful society.
Thank you so much for sharing your response. And these questions are open to any panelists who want to share. So if you do want to share, just unmute your mic and start talking.
Actually, I can add, sorry for the music on my background. I can add that I was impressed by the amount of interesting stories, how people struck the racism, how they fight against the racism, and I think it's a great point to think over the idea to maybe cooperate for something to be against the racism and to make some project. We can see that it is actual in any kind of the world, in any part of the world. So thank you for these inspiring stories and make me think how this problem is important.
Could I also add here to what Andrei said? Right now, I am in Bishkek, and we are also thinking about collaboration because we think that the best way to face and then to solve all these ethnical problems or racial problems is a collaboration with other countries. So we had a meeting with our Central Asian team, and we are thinking about doing projects together where we will involve the use of Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan. And we think that getting to know other cultures or getting to know other people closer will help them to solve this issue.
I think what I like about, what we saw in all of the videos and what everyone has said is that peace building and peace is not just confined to the borders of your country, because we also need to recognize that borders are not permanent and often they're social constructs. And we can't just rely on just the people who live within those borders to be the ones who are solving the issue. Having allyship and also solidarity with everyone, just like everybody here from the Ukraine to Afghanistan to North America. I think it's a fantastic way to begin and to continue these work that we're doing in peace building and to support each other in solidarity.
It looks like we have a question for Arwen. So Arwen, if you can unmute yourself really quickly. The question for you is, education must be cleansed of extensive impurities like racism, discrimination, bias, cronyism, inequality, and abuse. What do you think? Is forcing a group of people to give up their cultural heritage akin to genocide?
I think the first part of that problem is, I think the first thing we have to address is how important is culture, or how important is cultural identity to a people. And the problem there is, again, as is the case with most cases of racism and ethnic discrimination and whatnot. As I said in the recorded part of the panel video, the story I shared, the problem is racism and ethnic discrimination largely persists because the minorities, the people from different ethnic minorities and people belonging to these races and whatnot, they're considered subhuman. To put it bluntly, they're considered subhuman. In Bangladesh, the treatment that people from ethnic minorities receive on a regular basis is shameful for the rest of us as the majority, to be very honest. They're treated as subhuman. Their cultures are not respected. Their identities are not respected. And it goes into the territory of criticizing every aspect of their lives. Things like casual Facebook posts by people going on tour in the Chittagong Hill Tracts or whatever, and people coming across like villages and stuff in those areas where people from these minorities live, and casual Facebook posts taking pictures of them cooking, going about their day, or whatever, and posts just like it's ridiculing them and their culture, everything from their clothing to what they're eating. It's stuff like I don't know how well the Bangla is going to translate really, but it's sort of like, it's just making fun of them, making fun of their dresses, making fun of the way they move, the way they talk. And it's the problem with that is the people who are doing this are doing this without concern or considering the effects of that on the people who they're ridiculing. Their audience is people like them largely, and the posts are dehumanizing to a very large extent, because to them, to the person making the post, to the person dehumanizing these people, it's nothing more than just like 5 minutes of their time to say something like, that the person dresses funny. And that's where the culture part comes in. To you, like to the people who are doing the dehumanizing, it might seem like they're dressing funny. It might seem like they're eating stuff we don't eat. It might seem alien. And just because it seems alien doesn't mean you go up and make fun of it, because again, this is part of their culture. This is part of who they are. It's part of their identity. And on that note, while dehumanizing or belittling someone's culture might not be literally equal to genocide, honestly, how far away are we from genocide if you start by taking away someone's identity? Because the moment you start seeing someone as less than human is the moment you start devaluing their lives as a whole. It's the first step to separating yourself from someone else. And in that regard, yeah, taking away someone's culture or belittling or dehumanizing someone's culture is in fact a very serious thing to do. And it should be addressed, and it should not be normalized, it should be fought against. And people should be aware of the 5 minutes that they're spending on Facebook and how big of an impact that might make on the way to normalizing hate.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That was very powerful. I also do recognize that we are technically at the end of time, so if you do need to leave, thank you for coming. We really appreciate the time that you took of being here. But we will still be continuing with questions for panelists who are able to stay a little bit longer and for guests who also could stay. So moving on to the next question, which I will also put in the chat. Given the context of how COVID has exposed gaps of privilege in society, for instance, ranges of access to healthcare, exposure rates, etc., how should youth begin to mobilize to respond to this?
I would suggest that we should be running as politicians. For example, there's been 2 elections that I've been paying very, very close attention to recently. One, of course, is the American election, and then the other one is the election that we just had in my province, British Columbia in Canada. And the candidate that I was spending a lot of time volunteering for, she is millennial, so someone in her mid-20s. And even though she didn't end up winning her election, the point that she was trying to also get, she wanted to win, but like as one of the youngest candidates, she was also highlighting and generating a lot of publicity about how important it is to not just have the people who are mid-age or seniors, because that leads to an overrepresentation of focus on issues that only impact them. But what about issues that impact us, right? We can't just assume that older people will listen to what we are concerned about. For example, climate change, racial injustice, peace. We care, those are some of our top priorities. We also care deeply about the economy and also the environment as well, but we also want to make sure that it's a lot more equitable and it's a lot more equal. So I think to answer this question, we should begin to mobilize by trying to support each other, not just because we're youth, but really looking and having these discussions with the candidates who are running, whether they're older or whether they're younger, and seeing if their policies align with what you are concerned about, and really spending a lot of time really working to get them elected so that they're in office and then they do have not just a voice, but also a vote as well.
I agree with Alison actually, and talking about the COVID pandemic in Ukrainian society, there was like many Ukrainian activists draw a parallel with the 2014, where the Russian-Ukrainian war has started, and that was the time when all people, including the youth, was mobilizing their resources, and many volunteers was helping the army. And there was today it's actually a similar situation, but we are fighting with the COVID. And actually in Ukraine, I can say that many young people they participate in different volunteering services or different volunteering organization and help today our healthcare system to get out of it. So I can say that the youth should be involved to all the process that are today. And thank you for this event. Thank you for for this great experience. Thank you that we can talk here about this.
Of course, and thank you all for taking the time to come to this. Are there any other responses to this particular question? Okay, if not, we have one last question that we prepared. Thinking of widely known youth activists like Greta Thunberg, how do we get adults to listen?
I can start, and if anyone else has any other input, that would also be fantastic as well. I think that we could get people who are older to respond by, first of all, having these conversations within ourselves, within our immediate core group, because people tend to trust people they already know rather than having all these maybe ads playing that, you know, from people that they don't even know, right? So I think, you know, earlier during the videos, we've had the other panelists who also spoke about having conversations and starting inwards from ourselves and then gradually having more dialogue. I think that's how we can listen, and obviously getting pressure from an exposure from media, really trying to make sure that the journalists who are reporting are using the language that doesn't paint us and what we are doing, the world, the more equitable, the more just world that we are trying to have, as something that is a fantasy, that is something that is realistic and can happen. within our lifetimes. And it's very important that rather than just following with the status quo.
And I want to do some addition to this. It's not about our project focuses on local authorities and how to make them listen to the youth. So last month we were busy with the needs assessment, and then we were talking to the local authorities on finding out what the problem they are facing. And we have found out that they really need the help of youth, but they feel that it's better, they don't really feel the power of youth, and then they don't really see the power of the CSO organizations in Andijan. So next week we decided to have a training on social cohesion, where we are going to train all those adults or authorities, and then have a town hall meetings where they will be talking together with the youth and discussing some of their problems. And based on that, there will be grants for this youth to address one of the issues in their neighborhoods. And that's what we are thinking, and we are thinking this will have a ripple effect, and the government will start to see the youth as a resource, as a new ideas coming, and then maybe the people who could be used in a volunteer basis. Like recently we had a census, and all this government authority people, they had to go and get that census done, and they were complaining that they don't have enough human resources. So one of the ideas we gave was, why don't you just ask the youth to help you with doing this? Because if you just train active youth in your neighborhood or society, they could also help and be a good resource to help the government. This is the idea we're giving, and we are really hoping that the youth and the government will be working together by the end of our project.
As far as getting adults to listen, personally, I think what's most important for us as the youth is starting at the root level, starting with our own families, because I personally know people who have educated their parents, their people around them, about issues that their parents maybe did not believe or did not buy into previously. I have friends, and I myself am working on issues such as special needs education, and we regularly try and reach out not only to other youth but also to adults to try and educate them on different issues, from just treating children with special needs equally, treating them respectfully, to just respecting people and giving space to people and helping people with mental health issues and stuff like that. I have friends who are actively working for things like transgender rights, for LGBTQ plus issues. And from personal experience, what I've seen the most is, what's most effective is if you can manage to start one at a time, because not everyone is always able to have or to get a platform that is not just global. A lot of people aren't able to get even local platforms to communicate with multiple people at a time. So starting wherever you can, I feel like, is the solution. Talk to your parents, talk to your relatives, talk to your teachers, to your friends, educate who you can. Because if you believe in these issues and if you want these things to change, it starts at the simple things like telling telling an uncle not to call their colleague some specific name, not to be racist to a colleague, not to be racist to someone they know, the grocer, your teacher. Just communicating what you think can help change, communicating your ideology to them, and trying to educate the people around. As far as people like Greta Thunberg go, she is absolutely an inspiration, and she is an example of how the world will listen if there are loud enough voices. And even though we may not have a platform as big as she did, we have our surroundings and we are able to influence the people around us. And I believe that's where we need to start, because an important part of this is in the narrative itself. If we start by separating the youth and adults, if we start by saying, how do you convince the adults to listen to you? Instead of an us and them narrative, the narrative needs to be on the same level, because one of the most persistent things in our society currently is, especially in conservative societies, is children or just younger people in general aren't, there's a narrative that exists that younger people shouldn't be able to raise their voice with adults. They shouldn't be able to talk to adults or call them out on their prejudices. It's seen to be disrespectful when you do so. And I feel like that's where it starts. It starts with, instead of an us versus them narrative, it needs to be on a level where everyone involved is respectful and is listening. And that's how you bring about a change, by educating the people around you, essentially. Sorry, it's been a really long answer. I wish I could articulate better. Yeah, thanks.
Well, thank you for that. We actually have one final question that kind of actually speaks to Allison's point just now about making a book club. So this question's from Abrar Farhan Zaman. And so he asked, how important is it to decolonize the mind? Should books by Frantz Fanon, Aimé Césaire, among others, and poetry from the Harlem Renaissance be taught more often instead of the existing Western canon? And do you think no longer writing in the language of the oppressor was an effective way to enrich local writing?
I do think it's very important as well. And I think it goes back to my earlier point about engaging people from both the political aspect, because the people who determine what curriculum is taught at schools, at least from my knowledge of where I'm from, British Columbia, Canada, it lies in the provincial government. So making sure that we do have voices who are able to lobby for and also have the votes to enact change as well on that level. At the same time, from my knowledge of how things work in politics, is that there also needs to be a very big push from people who are asking for this, because governments, a lot of the times, they're not going to take high risks because obviously they do want to get reelected. That's usually one of their primary objectives. But if we show that there is a strong support for it from the public, then we can really push that forward as well. At the same time, education is not only limited to just schools. I think there's a lot of informal education that happens, like what Arwin was saying earlier about between, for example, families. And I think that is very important, just so to make sure that it's implemented at the policy level, at the school board level, at the same time, while also making sure that you're having these conversations and having these book clubs, informal book clubs, or maybe just having these discussion with your family or friends, acquaintances, that talks about these things. It doesn't mean that you necessarily have to have a formal structure to it. It could also be, for example, there's certain groups of friends that I do have that are not as ingrained in politics and as ingrained in social justice as I am. And when we talk about life updates, I would usually throw in, oh, I'm reading this book. And usually I would give them a short synopsis and then just engage with them on these topics, and encourage them to also think more about it, planting these seeds, right? And then so maybe with the hopes that maybe my friends or my acquaintances would go and think further from the seeds that I've planted.
Are there any last thoughts for this final question? Okay, well, it looks like we have come to a late closing for today's webinar, and I am sure that there are a ton of other questions and connections out there waiting to happen. So I will personally say that I would encourage you all to still seek those connections in the peace building community, because that is what makes the community so strong. So reach out to each other. If you have more thoughts, opinions on how to collaborate, I would strongly encourage that from my own personal experiences with peace work collaboration, which is what made today happen. But if you would like to rewatch or share any of these panels, they will all be available on GCPE's YouTube channel. This webinar was also recorded and will be uploaded on the same platform. We will also issue a report on the GCPE website. Before I provide a concluding statement, I would just like to give thanks to Narig Kuyumjian, Zila Jamshidi, Kaylin Johnston, and Tony Jenkins, colleagues of mine at GCPE who played crucial roles in making this webinar from both ideation to execution. I would also like to thank all of our incredible panelists who took the time to provide their insights in our interviews and in today's webinar. I would like to speak on behalf of both Nazila and I that conducting these interviews was such a rare and inspiring experience that we are both very grateful for. And equally as important, thank you to everyone who came today. The role you play in engaging with the peace-building community, even by attending short webinars like this one, is a role with greater significance than you may think. If I could leave everyone with one final sentiment, it would be the following: empower youth. There are a million great ideas and connections out there waiting to confront injustices in the world, and there is never too young of an age to start sharing those ideas. By broadening our communities to empower youth voices, we are giving the world a better chance at becoming the more equal, just, and equitable society we want it to be. Thank you all so much for coming, and have a lovely weekend.